Hi, and welcome to Bebop Scales. This is lesson number 4, which is a continuation of lesson number 3, where we're talking about the dominant bebop scale. And in this session, we're going to talk about playing the scale loop. The difference between playing a scale loop and an arpeggio loop is the three most commonly played arpeggios from the tonic and the third of the 2 chord and the third of the dominant chord. That's how I like to think of them. They all resolve down to 1, 3, 5, or 7 of the dominant 7th chord. If we're going to play scales going up, we can come down at any point in a scale, and we might be coming down from the 9th, the 11th, or the 13th. And those are of the dominant chord. Those are called the extensions. So if I was to play a dominant 7th chord, those 4 notes are just typically called the chord tones. And then the 3 notes left in the major scale above those, if I continue up in thirds, the 9, 11, and 13, are called the extensions. And by the time I've played those 7 notes, I've played all the notes in the key. So what we're going to examine here is how to get through the scale loop efficiently and how we play it in terms of how we come down from each one of the extensions. So at the top of the finale sheet here, I just have the dominant bebop scale coming down from the tonic that we know and love from our hard practice on the arpeggio loop. And then we're going to look in relatively arbitrary fashion at coming down from the extensions. So the first one I have illustrated here is coming down from the 13th of the dominant chord, although it's often going to be the 9th, considered the 9th of the 2 chord, and the 13th of the dominant chord is also the 6th of the dominant chord. So when I get to that note, E in the G7 chord, I go E, E flat, D. And so the determining factor that makes everybody learn these things such that they sound the same is the rule that we're operating from is when you get to a descending, the first downbeat you get to in a descending line, you figure out, is that one of the 4 chord tones of the dominant chord or not? And if it's an extension, then not one of the chord tones. Then you say, well, what can I do with half steps to get to a chord tone as quickly as possible? So in the case of coming down from this E on a G7, I go E, E flat, D, and then I'm on the G7 chord tone. If I didn't do that, I would be going E, D, C, and then that C creates a special dissonance, which we might really love and choose to use, but right now we're trying to figure out how to play these in every key by getting to the sound of the chord as efficiently and as quickly as possible. So instead of going E, D, C and creating issues with how we're going to make it sound like we're playing a G7 chord, we just say, okay, if I start on an E, I can go E, E flat, D, and then I'm back home because I'm on a G7, a 5/7 chord tone. Okay, so one of the ways I might get to that E on a downbeat, I could just start on that note. Or if I play my arpeggio loop, but I play a 5-note arpeggio, then that E is going to fall on a downbeat. So if I play D, F, A, C, E, that E is going to be on a downbeat, and then I will play it as indicated. I was trying to point, that didn't work. I'm going to use my little cursor here. And so coming down from this E is what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to play D, F, A, C going up to that E. And so that's the sound of coming down from the 13th. If I come down from the 9th of the dominant chord, as indicated here in line 3, A flat, G, F sharp, or G flat, F. This is the way jazz players tend to do it the most, where they'll go chromatically from the 9th down to the 7th. I don't have to do that. It would not be incorrect to go A, G, F, E, D, C, B, that's the G9 chord on downbeat notes, and it's going to sound fine. But jazz players tend not to do that as much as a chromaticism. Bluegrass players tend to play all their solos diatonically. Jazz players tend to use a lot of chromaticism. And so the other thing is that we get into the sound of the chord faster by following the rules I was just talking about. If I'm coming down from an A, first chord tone in the G7 chord below that A is a G. I can get to that G by going A flat, G. And so that's what I do in this example right here. And one of the things that's going to cause somebody to come down from an A is to start on the tonic of the corresponding 2 chord, D, and go D, E, F, G, A. And so I'm going to do that now and then come down from that A. So that was an example of coming down from the 9th. There's one note left, and that is the 11th. Now the 11th of a dominant chord is one of the most dissonant notes. In fact, I would say it is the second most dissonant note. I mean, if you think about a G7 chord, and you go up chromatically from G, the A flat is a flat 9 that gets used by jazz players. The A is the 9th, gets used very often. The B flat is a blues sound and it's a sharp 9, gets used all the time. The B is the 3rd. The C is a note with a lot of tension. I tend to call it the ultimate blue note. C sharp is a flat 5, gets used all the time. D is the 5th, very bland. E flat makes an augmented chord, gets done to dominant chords all the time. The E is the 6th, very pretty note. F is the 7th. F sharp is definitely your most dangerous note. You're going to hold on to an F sharp on the G7, hopefully less often than you choose to hold on to any other note on a G7. So back to the 11th of the chord. From this 11th of the chord, what I do is I use this device called Enclosure, which is to take a note that's a note with a lot of tension and then go to another note with a lot of tension, enclosing a note that's a release of that tension. So I'm going 11, flat 3 to the 3 by going C, B, flat, B. And if I were, again, to start on D and play D up to C and then play this example of Enclosure here in line 4, it would sound like this. So those are where I put the half steps in the extensions. That's to get into the sound of the chord as quickly as possible and to spell the chord as quickly as it can be done given the note that I'm starting coming down on the dominant chord from. The way I practice this, the loop exercise parallel to our hard-working arpeggio loop where we start on the 3rd of the dominant and go to the tonic of the minor and then the 3rd of the minor. On this, in the scale loop, I start on the tonic of the minor chord, go up to the 9th of the dominant, down to the 7th of the dominant, up to the 11th of the dominant. That's right here, 11th of the dominant, Enclosure, back to the 7th of the dominant, up to the 6th or 13th of the dominant, and then all the way down to the B. And you can see that it takes 5 measures to play this. If I was to stop on this B, which sounds fine, it only takes 4 measures to get through the scale loop. And so that scale loop sounds like this. So I, like my trumpet players, for example, just start that on a low A. And if you start on a low A, then you end up on a low F sharp. And after they do 2 or 3 minutes of other warm-ups, you use this as a warm-up, and then we don't worry about swinging it. You just play even eighth notes, and we get these half steps under our hands. etc., etc. So the scale loop is super, super important to understand because we don't want to be limited to starting on chord tones when we improvise. We want to continue a line from that we're playing in another chord, and we might enter the new chord on any degree of the scale that fits that chord. And so we have to be prepared to get into the sound of that chord as quickly as possible. And the scale loop is how we do that. Then what you're going to do with this, which we'll go over a couple lessons from now when we practice 2-5-1s, but then what you'll do with this is you'll combine the scale loop with the arpeggio loop. And when you do that, that means you can play 3-note arpeggios or 5-note arpeggios or 6-note arpeggios. Or you don't have to use an arpeggio to go up. You can use a scale to go up and practice this slowly and come up with things where you're mixing scales and arpeggios and you're following these rules, and you will end up playing notes that are coherent and logical to spell dominant 7th chord or to spell the 2-5. An example of doing that, I'll play an arpeggio and a scale, or a scale and arpeggio and BS. So I need more practice. You probably do too. In any event, that is how we play the scale loop and how we combine it with the arpeggio loop. Lesson 5 is going to be on where the half steps go in major chords, and then lesson 6 or 7 will be about practicing 4-measure 2-5s, where we have to negotiate keeping track of how long we're playing the dominant bebop scale and then transition it into the major bebop scale, which is what will allow us to sound like we're making changes and we really know what we're doing, which is the object here. Okay, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you soon.